Good morning. My name is Donald McQuaid. I'm a professor of English and American Studies here at the University of California. Vice Minister Wang, Chairman Leach, Mr. Consul General, distinguished colleagues and guests from the People's Republic of China and from across the United States, it's a great pleasure to add my voice to the chorus of welcome to the second U.S.-China Cultural Forum and also to the University of California at Berkeley. The focus of our conversation in this roundtable session is literary heritage and creativity. Our plan will be to follow the pattern of the previous session. Each of our four panelists will speak in the order listed in the program. To devote as much time as possible to conversation, I'd like to direct your attention to each speaker's biography printed in the program. Each panelist will offer relatively brief remarks, and they will engage in a conversation with each other, and we expect with some, and we hope with many of you. Creativity is built, like everything else we treasure, with long, hard work, and that work begins with a foundation, a thorough understanding of what is known and how it came to be known, what is unknown, and what among the many unknown is important for us to know. Before we create anything new, we need to know and to understand what is already present. So I'd like to begin this roundtable discussion on literary heritage and creativity with an observation about contemporary China and a recommendation, a respectful recommendation, based on my many years traveling to China and speaking with educational, business, and government leaders there. The observation is, innovation and creativity have become a national mission for China. Perhaps most recently and spectacularly expressed in the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympic Games, the purposefully and breathtakingly elegant choreography of creativity displayed on that occasion sent generations of stereotypes and cliched ideas about China and images of it up in smoke when the Olympic torch was lit the night of August 8th, 2008. China continues to build an infrastructure of innovation and creativity, and at an astonishing rate. For example, by the year 2020, China's highway system will be larger than that of the United States. Innovation-driven companies, led in appreciable measure by a wave of counter-diaspora talent, are popping up in the nooks and crannies of old warehouses and factory districts in China's major cities. And a closer look reveals that creativity is surfacing more visibly, not only in the commercial arts, in design, fashion, media, and the like, but also is now abundantly evident in nearby cafes, art studios and galleries, as well as in its theaters, and on its bustling sidewalks and street corners. China's creative heritage, and especially its literary traditions, reflect thousands of years of achievement. So it will be especially informative to hear from Dr. Lu Mengxi and Mr. Mui Yan about the current state of literature, and especially the novel, and its relationship to China's magisterial literary heritage, as well as about the cultural and pedagogical conditions within which creativity continues to flourish in China's schools and universities, as well as in the minds, hearts, and hands of its creative artists, and especially its writers. I trust also that our distinguished Chinese colleagues will be interested in engaging in dialogue about the place of creativity, and especially its literary heritage, and even more particularly poetry, within the contemporary American university, and particularly within the pressured context of undergraduate education and the Anglo-American tradition of liberal education that informs it. Before inviting our panelists to speak, I'd also like to offer a respectful recommendation. I would like to encourage our guests to visit the CV Star East Asian Library. The Star Library, which is part of the Zhonglin Tian Center for East Asian Studies, is UC Berkeley's most splendid realization of the intersections of the operative terms of our conversation this morning: literary, heritage, and creativity. The CV Star Library contains one of the most comprehensive collections of materials in East Asian languages and literatures in the United States. The architects, Todd Williams and Billy Tsian, described this stunning building as a symmetrical box broken by light. I'm delighted to note that Billy Tsian is here in the audience today and will speak this afternoon as part of the Roundtable on Tradition and Innovation in the Visual Arts. The CV Star East Asian Library is situated on Memorial Glade, the heart of the Berkeley campus, and is cut deeply into a steep hillside. University design guidelines for representing the heritage of the classical core of the campus required a pitched clay tile roof, a symmetrical facade, and use of white granite. Billy Tsian and Todd Williams creatively recast the blend of these elements by reinterpreting the use of a screen, an important element of Asian architecture. In this instance, they used both a traditional cracked ice and contemporary grid pattern. Sand cast in China, this monumental bronze screen is 120 by 35 feet, is the building's expression of its Asian identity. It unifies the exterior and creates the illusion of symmetry from the asymmetrical arrangement of windows. From the exterior, the facade is solid, powerful, and mysterious. From the interior, the screens offer a dynamic and filtered view of the surrounding landscape. It is no coincidence that the CV Star Library, as well as the larger campus of UC Berkeley, are perched on the fragile East Bay Hills and look directly out across San Francisco Bay toward East Asia. The elegant simplicity of the Star Library celebrates the magnificent heritages that forever link China and the United States, the Star Library, and the larger world around it. These are reflections and remind us of these reflections remind us in the Berkeley community of how and where creativity can flourish and heritage can thrive. Our first speaker is Dr. Liu Mengxi. Dr. Mengxi is the director of the Institute of Chinese Culture of the Chinese National Academy of Arts and tutor of literature and art science and art theory.
Thank you. I am very honored to attend the second U.S.-China Cultural Forum. My presentation is about whether mankind can have its redemption in non-confrontation in the 21st century. Given the time limit, I will simplify my presentation. I will focus not on culture itself, but what's behind culture for the fate of humanity. I liked very much what James said this morning: culture is larger than politics. 20 years ago, I started a cultural publication magazine. In there, I said, culture lasts longer than politics. So I'm very glad that that has been echoed here. I feel I have a concern recently, and a great concern. In my research institute, we also have discussed this concern as well. And this is are concerned about humanity. Sometimes in the world, people care too much about interests, especially in the political discourse. We often judge evaluate by win, victory or loss. I think that's a mistake, a blind zone. From a cultural perspective, if we look back at the 20th century, did the West win or did the East win? The West may have won, but the East did not necessarily lose. We can't judge with such terms. I don't necessarily 21st century is Eastern century. Culture belongs to the entire mankind. Looking forward to the 21st century, I do have a concern, which is many modern powers. They have too powerful. They have powerful weapons, and this is more serious than it ever has been in the past in history. In the 19th century, who would have thought that there would be two world wars? Human nature dictates that we tend to make the same mistake, repeat the same mistakes. Some countries today have destructive weapons more powerful than it ever had. And that's even in India, where Mr. Gandhi proposed non-violence and non-confrontation. They are saber wielding as well. People may not have anticipated. As soon as we entered 21st century, we seem to be in a crossroad. The planet Earth is no longer limitless, with limitless resources. When financiers, politicians view it, fabricate ridiculous theories, they did not prepare how the Earth would respond. The Earth is being run over capacity. Climate change, global warming, blood floods. Floods are as if the Earth is tearing. Earthquakes are the rage of the Earth. All cultures, we have to work together. I agree with Professor Yu. There is a lot of commonality between cultures. No single country can exist by itself. 10 years ago, I came to Yale University. I met several scholars, Professor Whitman, who passed away, and several others. I was a visiting scholar at Harvard University as well. When I had the opportunity to meet Professor Huntington. Professor Huntington overstressed, I believe, overstressed the differences between cultures. I think he did not stress enough our commonalities. I think all cultures are interdependent. The East cannot be without the West and vice versa. Harmony on top of diversity is the goal. So our classics say,
讲的就是这个道理。东方文明中，比如说中国传统文化里边，是不是也含有供人类取之的普世价值呢？我认为那是不用质疑的。作为中国学术思想源头的六艺之学，也就是六经，其义理内涵与人类的普遍精神追寻可谓是同一指归。而孔子的仁术思想，
The Confucius
不施于人的学说，
belief of
显然应该成为
forgiveness,
人类的共德。
compassion, and don't do upon others what you don't want yourself still apply today.
它属于可以作为人类的普世价值。还有
It's a value that can apply to the whole world.
尊敬的敬，这个敬不只是对他人的尊敬，
Is not only respect for
一个人
others
自己内心的庄严，
and also dignity
也应该是属于
upon
人类的
oneself.
国力资源。不过，西方传统中
In Western tradition, there are similar beliefs as well,
不是哪个好哪个不好，
and there's
而是对
no
话和
there's nothing superior or inferior.
社会制度
It's mutual
是历史的
understanding.
阶段性形态，文化精神的理性之光是永恒的。但是各个国家的
Different countries, their economic models and cultural civilization,
完全整齐划一，
they of course
文化
cannot
资源的整合
be all the
必须是各
same.
国家追寻的既定目标。全球化的理想是令人神往的，
Globalization, global value is a
我认为
lofty
是一个
goal.
危险的口号，因为那
But,
就意味着人类将接受霸权的主宰。
That goal itself, I think it could be dangerous because it may morph into overpower, dominance by one culture.
还有不祥之兆。距今1000多年的宋代思想家张载，
Mr. Zhang Zai, who lived 1,000 years ago, wrote a book
而在正盟这个书的第一篇叫
on theory of politics. The first chapter had 4 sentences.
私有对，对必反其为，有反私有仇，仇必合为邪。这是他对宇宙世界图景
Which expressed
合理的认知。
his philosophy towards the universe.
人类不会在永远
The human cannot live in eternal confrontation.
共存
They have to live in peaceful coexistence.
佛学大师他已经去世了。
A Chinese philosopher, Mr. Zhao Puchu,
年之交，我们
he was my
他非常
great friend. He liked very much
鲁迅的两句诗，
Lu Xun's
这
poem,
两句诗是
which says,
不尽解剖兄弟在，相逢一笑泯恩仇。我认为他说出了
enemies can become friends with a smile.
总是在仇恨中做一个
Why do people have to live in hatred?
微山教
I
授
also agree with Mr. Wei Shan this morning when he explained his sculptural work. Let's not remember hatred.
不必记住仇恨。
We remember history, but not the hatred, which I concur
我
sincerely.
个人多年研究中国文化，
Also, I'd like to express the Chinese culture is not aggressive.
不具有侵略性，它不强加于人，
It doesn't impose.
它讲宽
It
容。
values
所以
harmony
当不同的
and
宗教到
tolerance.
中国来的时候，
So when different religions come to China,
在东汉时期，佛教
They
传
don't-
入中国的时候，
they don't have
是非常
big
平静的
conflicts.
静悄悄地传入的，有
They come peacefully.
包容性，当然也有冲突，是当时的道家的一些代表人物。
Of course, there were at the time there were some disagreements between the Taoists and the Buddhists. For example, there
但是
was
总的来说，
Fan Zhen
儒释
who
道
wrote
三家思想，他们合作的。
about his own
所以
beliefs,
在中国文化
but by and large, they had peaceful coexistence.
三教不同的
The
宗教
three
信仰都可以合一。
religions,
那么在人类
if the religions
不
can
同的文化
live
可以
alongside, why can't people?
其实语言不同都可以谈恋爱。
And people can fall in love with different languages.
我在哈佛大学跟这个
When I was in Harvard University, I had a conversation with one of the professors. He encourages cross-cultural exchanges, and he had a theory. He says
语言
language
对人类的思维并
has the language impact of language is not as severe as big as what people think. People have commonalities. We all like beauty, compassion, peace. We don't want war. We don't want violence. Really, people are the same on many levels. Why can't we have dialogue? Then, so we need to look in culture and look at fundamental values, and that would be the basis of coexistence. So if I am to make predictions of the future of mankind, I believe in the end, harmony, which we believe in Chinese values. Harmony and coherence. Back in since very early of the Chinese culture, we believed there's not a lot of differences. So that's the basic for mankind.
Our next speaker is Professor Andrew DELBANCO. Professor DELBANCO is a distinguished scholar of American literature, as well as the director of the American Studies program at Columbia University. Professor DELBANCO.
Good morning. First, I should apologize for my voice. I brought a microbial friend with me from New York, which is doing its best to reduce me to silence, though a few friends in the room know that that's not very likely to happen. But I will sound a little croaky, and for that I apologize. I'd like to join all the other speakers in thanking very sincerely both our American and Chinese hosts for including me in these proceedings. There's a part of me, I confess, that suspects it was something of a mistake that I was invited or perhaps a courtesy to my wife, who will be making some substantive remarks after lunch about comparisons between Chinese and Western culture and the visual arts. And so I'd like to think of myself as a sort of symbol of the spirit of the conference. That is, it's an act of tolerance that when the mistake was discovered, the invitation was not rescinded. Anyway, here I am, and I will try to use my few minutes to make a few reflections on the career, what might be called the career of literature in our universities, mainly here in the United States. And this is going to be very compressed, but I'm going to try to make some remarks that span a period of roughly 4 centuries, which, as Pauline, you remarked earlier this morning, is a pretty long time by American standards, a very short time by Chinese standards, which is something I learned from my late father-in-law, to whom I was very close, a distinguished historian of Chinese art, Wycombe Ho, because I realized not long after joining the Ho family that for Wycombe the word recently meant roughly 900 years ago, and the word soon meant sometime in the next millennium. So I have some sense of that distinction. In any case, if we go back to the beginning of what we now customarily call higher education in what became the United States, we discover that the two terms, which I want to frame my remarks, literature and university, although the words existed, they didn't mean anything much like what they mean now. There were, properly speaking, no universities in North America at that time. The word university was used by people like the evangelical Christian minister Jonathan Edwards in a phrase like the university of things, by which he meant the entire created universe in which all of God's creations were intimately related to one another and all part of an indissoluble whole, which is in some respects perhaps the ideal aspiration that universities still have for themselves. The word literature, as it referred to what was studied in the institutions of the time, which were more properly called colleges than universities, was mainly theological literature. And I like to, at every opportunity, so I'm going to take the opportunity, I like to read the words that were uttered in what we might regard as the first mission statement or the first fundraising statement in the history of American higher education, composed by the founders of our first college, Harvard College, who wrote back to their Puritan friends in England basically to ask them for financial support with the following terms that, despite their mercenary purpose, I still find quite moving today. After God had carried us safe to New England, and we had built our houses, provided necessaries for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. Now, there are a lot of things that could be said about this. I called it a fundraising statement. So one thing that could be said about it is that it signals the sort of hybrid nature of American institutions of higher learning, which have always been neither completely public nor completely private, but have always been some combination of the two. This great university, which is hosting us here today, is a public university in a large sense, but it's also the beneficiary of many private benefactions, and people who give support to it enjoy tax advantages. So the public-private distinction is an interesting dimension of the history of higher education in the United States, something that we might wish to talk about. Another thing, though, that can be said about that passage, what did they mean by advance and perpetuate, but particularly advance? They didn't, I think, mean anything very close to the conventional language that we now encounter in the mission statements of most present-day universities. That is, the language we're accustomed to is the language of by which a university says we are at the frontier of knowledge. We are at the cutting edge of knowledge. We wish to advance knowledge in this sense. My sense is that the founders of these first colleges meant it in a different way. They meant it more in the sense of disseminating revealed truth, that is, disseminating truths that had already been received and were fundamentally unchanging. We've heard something about the missionary spirit of American culture and the role it played in our relationship with China over the years. So that, I think, was the force of the word advance at the very beginning. Now, what about literature? Literature meant chiefly scripture. The Hebrew scriptures, which Christians call the Old Testament, and those books that Christians call the New Testament, and to some extent commentaries on scripture. And as time went on, more and more classical writers from the Greek and Roman traditions who were turned to for guidance in such matters as rhetoric and logic in the service of moral education, which was the fundamental purpose of these early American institutions of higher learning. Now, skipping over about 200 years, when we arrive at the middle or the third quarter, let's say, of the 19th century, I think we find that the conception of knowledge on which this educational mission had originally been based begins to change in very fundamental ways. And it is at that moment in our history when we see the emergence of institutions that could properly be called universities. They were based primarily on the model of the German research university, which introduced into the Western world such fundamental concepts as academic freedom, which is to say the untrammeled pursuit of knowledge and the results of that pursuit being subject to judgment not by any external authorities, but by peers of those who are engaged in that pursuit of knowledge. If we look at the early statements of what these new institutions were about, we find a very different note from the one that I've sounded so far. Daniel Coit Gilman, who was mentioned by Pauline Yu this morning as an early president of the University of California, moved east and became the first president of the first genuine American research university, Johns Hopkins, whose purpose, he said, was to show students how to extend, even by minute accretions, the realm of knowledge. And there we arrive at the modern conception of the university, it seems to me. The most influential proponent of that view was Charles W. Eliot, descended from Puritans, but himself a chemist, who became president of Harvard in the later 19th century and described one of the important functions of universities as to store up the accumulated knowledge of the race, by which he meant the human race in the universalist sense that we've been speaking of it here this morning, so that each successive generation of youth shall start with all the advantages which their predecessors have won. I call this, and I don't mean to be disparaging of it, but I call this the sort of relay race view of human history, that one generation arrives at certain insights, discoveries, and passes them on to the next generation so that they don't have to be rediscovered, but so that the quest for knowledge can begin anew from a more advanced point from where it was before. This is, to my naive understanding, fundamentally the way science works. And what we hear in these articulations of the purpose of the university is the growing significance and dominance of the scientific paradigm in the world of higher education, which is more and more apparent in the United States, and which is the cause in many respects for great celebration and cultural pride, because the accomplishments of science have been legion and promise to continue to be considerable, and we all owe it an enormous debt. It is the case, however, I think, for the purposes of my subject, that this vision of education and the purpose of educational institutions constituted a very profound challenge for the humanities, for literary study in particular, as to how on earth they would fit in to this new paradigm of understanding. My own sense, and this may be somewhat eccentric, is that they've had a lot of trouble articulating to themselves and to the public how they fit in to this paradigm. They tried it for a while at the end of the 19th century when these universities first came into existence through such exercises as the study of philology, that is, the study of the genealogy of languages and the interrelationships among languages, which could be done more or less empirically. They did it through some very important work, which continues in some measure still today, that is the establishment of reliable texts, the collation of various versions of texts from the past. They did it through biography, which was once an active feature of American universities, less so now than it used to be. But in general, I think they've had a lot of trouble fitting in, and I won't take more time to say more about that. What I would like to claim is that the entrance of vernacular literature, that is literature in the English or American language as well as in other modern languages, was a very late development in the history of American higher education, and it basically came in under the banner of Matthew Arnold, who wrote famously in his own definition of culture that we've been discussing here this morning, that culture is the pursuit of perfection by means of getting to know the best which has been thought and said in the world. Now, we've been very slow in taking seriously the global implications of world, and Arnold himself had a somewhat provincial view of what that meant, no doubt. But you hear in that articulation that the teaching of literature in the university is in service of the purpose of introducing the coming generation to the accumulated treasures of the human race, not just in literature, but in all fields of inquiry. We less often, I think, pay attention to the second part of his definition, in which he goes on to say that through this knowledge, we turn a stream of fresh and free thought upon our stock notions and habits. In other words, Arnold is often caricatured, in my view, as a cultural conservative, actually saw literature as an instrument for radical questioning of our cultural assumptions about the past and the present. In America, I think that has been the fundamental spirit of literary study, even to the extent that it's been domesticated and tamed in our universities. Our own version of Matthew Arnold, one might say, was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who defined literature in a way that I've always liked. He says, literature is a point outside of our hodiernal circle, our circle of present-mindedness, through which a new one may be described. The use of literature is to afford us a platform whence we may command a view of our present life, a purchase by which we may move it. In other words, literature, in this view, is fundamentally in opposition, skeptical, and even hostile to the constructions that we call culture of the present moment. And it's worth remembering that the books that we now regard as classics, such as my favorite Moby Dick, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, or a novel by Sinclair Lewis like Babbitt, were all at one time or another described as offensive, outrageous, cryptic, there's just a few adjectives, degrading, demeaning, bewildering, and certainly unworthy of serious study. I think that's worth keeping in mind. So literature, in other words, what is the function of literature in the university? It seems to me the function of literature is to help us question whatever prevailing doctrines may be in force at the present time in the culture in which we find ourselves, whether they are the doctrine of the free market as the solution to all problems, or centralized planning as the solution, or human nature as best described by St. Augustine as a creature enslaved to original sin, or by Rousseau as a creature of nobility and innocence. And so on and so forth. The function of a literary education, then, is to assist in the development of an individual critical faculty, independence of mind, and creativity, to use the rather charged word of our present session. There are more things to say about how literary education might proceed, but I'll skip over that in the interest of time. I want to close by making just two other presentist remarks. One is that if we're honest about the situation, at the present time in the United States, this dimension of education is in very serious trouble. About a week ago, one could read in the New York Times that a counterpart public institution to this one, the State University of New York at Albany, announced that its departments of French, Italian, Russian, and classics would all be closed. Here in California, at the University of California, Los Angeles, several humanities departments are, as I understand it, likely to be combined, which is intellectually defensible, but which probably means that they will play a smaller and smaller role in the institution. And the last thing I want to say, just by way of a sort of footnote to all of this, is that if we want to talk and think about the relation of universities to literature, we want also to recognize that particularly in the United States, and particularly in the last 50 or 60 years or so, universities have taken up the role of being patrons to the arts in a way that was not true in the past and has not been so true in other cultures. That is, if we think about the history of literature as having once been supported by aristocratic patrons, and then once upon a time supported by a thriving literary marketplace, which seems to be in a lot of trouble today, there is a sense in which the university is an essential prop or support for the production of creative writing today in a way that it has never been before. The premise of all of this is that I think universities, whether they are American universities or Chinese universities, universities without literature in these several senses are diminished institutions, and I suspect that literature without universities would be a diminished institution. That's a big generalization. I'm presumptuous enough to think it might actually be true across cultures. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Mui Yan. Mr. Yan is an internationally acclaimed novelist and a research fellow of the Arts Creation Center of the Chinese National Academy of Arts. Mr. Yan.
Good morning, everyone. In the earlier session, I sat by the two interpreters. I was I saw them very nervous when Professor Yu was making her presentation. Professor Yu is the most articulate person in China. And there is nothing superfluous. And she's very fluid. With such articulation, it's probably a bad enemy to interpreters. And whereas when it comes to me, I'm probably a better friend to the interpreters. Before I came here, the organizers of the event ordered us. So I prepared an article 5,000 words, and then I realized that that was a waste of, that was for nothing. So in the future, if I attend this again, I will ignore your request. I will not write a single word. Why do I say that? Why do I bring up the issue of interpretation? Well, when it comes to literature exchange without translation, then it would be futile. Sculpture probably defies language, verbal communication. Music, perhaps. Dance, acrobat, no interpreting. But when it comes to literature, translation is indispensable. Professor Han is smiling. The Chinese scholar, outstanding Chinese scholar here in America. He made great contribution to cultural exchanges between the countries. According to Mr. Qian, famous Chinese scholar, when Chinese, the earliest translation of American works was back in 1864, a poem. The translator was a diplomat, a Qing diplomat in the U.S. He had very little to do with the common man. The translation was more of an aristocratic game. In 1901, a person who knew nothing about, who knew no foreign language, in cooperation with somebody else, translated the Uncle Tom's Cabin. It had great influence on Chinese literature. Last century, in the 20s and 30s, there was a great movement of translating American literature. And then after 1949, I can say that the translation of American works diminished. We translated more Russian and European, including French works. And then in the 80s, China was opened up. And Chinese literature, American literature was translated more again. Foreign literature was translated more and more, and American literature was the number one among that. In the 80s, so translation of American literature is a big subject of study. An illiterate person like me, I can just scrap the surface. I want to talk a little about the influence of American literature on people like me. In 1984, in the winter, a very snowy night, I borrowed Faulkner, a book by Faulkner, Sound and Fury. This book, I read the Chinese version by a famous translator. The preface was as long as 30,000 words. I felt, but that made me very familiar with Mr. Faulkner. And then his novel itself, after 10 pages, I put it down. After the prefix, I felt Mr. Faulkner was just a regular old man, and he's kind of off. He's a bit off, and lots of lies. And he'd never flown. He's never piloted a plane, but he said he was flying and he was fighting the fast Nazis. And he said he had a bullet in his head. Why was his work so long and so? That probably can be explained by that fragment of the bullet. I felt a resonance between myself and Mr. Faulkner. Since childhood, I've been rumbling. Even though my name is Mo Yan, which means don't talk, I was actually a very talkative kid. Because of that, I can't count how many times I was beaten by my parents. My mother said, if you if you do that again, I will stitch your mouth. Even though my sister said, even if you stitch it, he would talk nonsense between the stitches. And in the 80s, I started writing, and remembering my parents, I gave myself a name, Don't Talk. I'm still talking. I'm still talking everywhere in China, and now I'm talking outside of the country too. My biggest inspiration from Mr. Faulkner, besides the personality resemblance, is my family background. He's a farmer. Even though he became a famous author, he still believed that he's a farmer. Well, the stories that he wrote basically were stories in his hometown, in the countryside. The countryside, which is as big as a stamp. He founded some kind of county. Maybe you can't even find it on the map. And that county is probably based on his hometown. And he was just writing about stories in that county. But even though that county is very small, but it was representative. That made me realize that if a writer can establish himself, he must establish his own republic. He created his own county. So I created a village in the northeast region region of China. So I based it on my own hometown as well and established a realm for myself. Before I read Faulkner, I was influenced more by Chinese conservative school, and I couldn't find any inspiration. Even though I looked in the paper, from the radio, and I couldn't find anything. After Faulkner, it occurred to me that my own experience, my own life, in that little village, they can all become stories and literature. My family, people that I am familiar with, the villagers, they can all become my characters. So I wrote a lot of long works and short works. several hundreds of characters. Most of them, you can find them in real life. Besides Faulkner, I've also been influenced by Hemingway, Old Man and the Sea. I think in my generation, everyone has read his work. But relative to Faulkner, I actually honestly like him less because Mr. Hemingway, his sentences are too short, too concise. No waste. I don't like sentences with no waste. Hemingway is not like my personality, but there are many writers in China who do like him. Jack London, another writer in America, he wrote lots of stories which took place in Alaska. He wrote about animals, about a dog, how it became a wolf. It resonated with me too, because I lived in countryside and I had lots of interaction with the animals, perhaps more than with humans. I raised a dog. I saw his dog, and that awoke my memories with my dog. So I wrote about my dog too, including my recent stories, novels. I, of course, also wrote about cows, horses. And a critic said in China, how do you write so well about cows? I said, well, in my previous life, I must be a cow. And what about pigs? I said, I raised pigs for a long time, so I know them very well, how they think. I don't know as well about humans, but I can see through cows and the pigs. So that's what's behind why I like to write animals so much. So that's about me. Because of outstanding translators, they brought American literature to China and gave me inspiration and influenced me greatly. Earlier translators in China translating foreign literatures, they didn't pay much attention to their artistry, and that had to do with the situation at the time. They believed that the novels are political tools, propaganda. They're tools for social change. For example, Lin Shu, when they translated, they emphasized the spirit or the themes of the novels. And when I later see that foreign translators, when they translate Chinese works, they wanted their readers to see the political changes, economic changes, which is not wrong, but I believe a good translation should place artistry the first. So later on, the China scholars, their translation began to pay attention to that artistry, place that as the prime importance. So from that, foreign readers can experience the art of Chinese literature. I talked about the influence of foreign literature on China. I believe over time, Chinese literature can probably have influence on American writers as well, especially the younger one. So as I said, I've been influenced by Faulkner, Hemingway, and Jack London. Perhaps in 50 years or 100 years, perhaps an American writer would say, I have been influenced by a Chinese writer named Mo Yan. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Our fourth speaker is Christopher Merrill, a widely published and celebrated poet. Professor Merrill is also the director of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa.
Thank you very much. And in addition to thanking our hosts, Chairman Leach and Vice Minister Wang, I'd like to thank our translators who are working so hard to bring this to us. And I'm quite certain that in 50 years there will be a lot of American writers who will say that they owe a debt to Mo Yan, particularly to his wonderful novel, Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out. And I thought I might just say here, in the spirit of this interchange, he talked about reading, Mo Yan started talking about reading The Sound and the Fury and putting it down after 10 pages. When Faulkner won the Nobel Prize, one of his friends who did not know he was a writer said that he had gone down to the library and taken out a novel of his called something like The Sound and Faulkner said The Sound and the Fury. And this friend said, you know, I read the first page of that novel 5 times and I have only one question for you. And Faulkner said, yes. And he said, was you drunk when you wrote that book? And Faulkner replied, not all the time. Just as Mo Yan was influenced by American writers, so I was influenced by Chinese writers. I was here more than 30 years ago for a semester as a student at University of California, Berkeley. I had chased a woman here. She went on to marry somebody else. But along the way, I took a class about a graduate class on Ezra Pound. And in that class, we read his translations of Cathay that he made based on the rudimentary translations of Fenollosa. And that introduction to the poets of the Tang Dynasty was, for me, as for so many young American writers throughout the 20th century, absolutely crucial to my own sense of what it might be to become a poet. The image was everything. That's what Pound took from the Tang Dynasty poets. Whether he was right or not, it informed almost all contemporary American poetry for this last century. And so that debt that Mo Yan talks about is a debt that American poets also feel. What's funny is that I was thinking about this last night when I got to town. I lived actually 1 block behind the hotel I'm staying in, and my roommate was a Chinese engineering student who had almost no English at all, and it turns out he was as bad a cook as I was, and we would cook for each other during the course of that semester. It's remarkable that we didn't die. But I was reading Pound and eating his food, and he was eating my food, and in some fashion, I was becoming a poet. I was serving that apprenticeship that all young writers serve by reading widely, reading deeply, immersing oneself in another idiom. And that idiom for me was the idiom that Ezra Pound was bringing into American writing. All these years later now, I run a program that has been bringing Chinese writers to the University of Iowa for a 3-month-long residency. And among the luminaries we've had the good luck to host are Mo Yan and Li Rui and Bei Dao and Ding Ling and Wang Meng and Yu Hua and Su Tong. And what happens every fall over the course of our residency is that we engage in a conversation about how writers do their work. We influence one another, we translate one another, we deepen our perspectives on what it means to be a writer. some years ago, Chairman Leach suggested to me that we might try to create a more formal exchange between young American writers and young Chinese writers. So we put together a program called Life of Discovery, and I know time is short, so I'm just going to give you a brief case study of this to give you a sense of how an exchange between two literary cultures can take place. This is something that happens within the context of our larger program, but over the course of 2 years, we brought about a dozen young American writers between the ages of 25 and 40 to China, and the Chinese sent a like number of writers to America. And the notion was not just an exchange of delegations, but to actually put the writers into conversation together, to try to forge a collaboration, see what we might be able to do. So we had a lot of different kinds of writers. We concentrated to a certain extent on attracting writers from minority groups in the United States, as well as minority groups from Western China. And at the end of our last exchange this summer in Yunnan province, we came up with an exercise. The idea was to have exercises each day, to read works in common, whether it was Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which the Chinese hated, or Yu Hua's To Live, which the Americans loved. But the Americans, when they realized how fierce the Chinese were about it, thought, well, wait a minute, we're not going to take any prisoners either. So we had very lively conversations. So we had these kinds of conversations, and then we were setting writing exercises for each other. And on the last night, having gotten to know one another very closely over the course of weeks, traveling together, seeing sights, reading books in common, arguing, trying to figure out what it means to be a writer, we thought, let's try this for a final exercise. Let's think about what it is that we do as writers, and that what we see in our colleagues from across the ocean, what they seem to do. Let's see if we can't invite each side to write about those sorts of things that they seem to neglect, that they seem not to have an interest in. So for the Americans, what we noticed in our Chinese colleagues was that there was a great emphasis on harmony, and some of the very issues that we've been hearing about this morning, coming out of Buddhism, out of Confucianism, and out of Taoism. And we thought, well, we know that there's another kind of history going on here, and to invoke Walt Whitman again, we thought one of the crucial parts of American literature, Whitman said, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. So we invited our Chinese friends to try to write about something that would partake of conflict, that in some fashion would try to address a conflict. The Chinese writers took a look at us and said, you American writers, you have no philosophy. You know, I mean, I think they were really being quite gentle. What they wanted to say is that you guys don't think at all. But they were also really talking about, I think, a larger, more philosophical, even a religious bent to the writing, such as we might have been discussing here in terms of Buddhism or Taoism or Confucianism. And so they suggested to one of our writers, we'd like you to write a poem that takes as its title the title of a novel then that we had been discussing by a Shanghai-based writer, Wang Anyi, called Song of Everlasting Sorrow. It's also a very famous poem from the Tang Dynasty. And they invited the American writers to write a poem about that. We invited the Chinese writers to write about some kind of conflict. What happened when we finished writing these pieces and read them aloud around this table in a hotel in Yunnan province in Kunming was that every single one of the writers wrote the most interesting pieces they had ever written. Now, I took from that, I had in mind the late James Merrill, not my relative. I always say that I was never close enough relatives to have either inherited his talent or his money, but I sure loved him. And I understand that at the end of his life, he was writing imitations of poems by John Ashbery. Now, Merrill was our great formalist, Ashbery one of our greatest experimenters. And it struck me that a poet at the end of his life trying to take on some other style of thought, some other way of proceeding, that could only broaden his aesthetic perspectives. And that's, I think, the kind of thing that we managed to do in this program we call The Life of Discovery. I hope we get to do more of that. Thank you very much.
We're pressing up against 12:30, but I think that we should provide the opportunity perhaps for a question from the audience. Yes, please.
My name is Leah Wakeman. I will ask questions. Okay, hello, everybody. My name is Leah Wakeman, and I will ask questions to our speakers in Chinese first, and then summarize it in English. 首先我就想介绍一下，我叫梁和，我对刘梦溪先生的讲话我就特别感动，因为他是第一个提出了忧患意识。因为现在在文化交流的歌舞升平的表面有很多问题，这个问题，而且文化交流的实质应该是理念的交流和普世价值的交流。这个问题我觉得这个会上没有提到，但是刘梦溪先生的话点到了。莫言先生，我在多年前他到 Berkeley 来，我们听过他的说话，我非常感动。当初他讲到他受福克纳的影响的时候，这个文学性的叙述比今天要强多了。今天当然根据这个现场，他是即兴发挥，所以我想要提出的问题是向莫言先生，就是说，作为你这一代作家，曾经是主导了中国的文学，你在中国文学的文坛上是起了里程碑作用的这么一个角色。今天你面临的挑战和重新定位自己和在文化中的这个作用，你的思考是怎么一种形式？同时你是怎么重新给自己定位的？My question is that, first of all, I appreciate Mr. Liu's mentioning of his deep concerns about conflicts and potential problems of today, even in the culture sphere and the international exchange spectrum. But my question basically directs to Mr. Mo Yan, who I admire and who I've met many years ago in Berkeley, and when Fred was in life, and we had Mo Yan as an honored guest speaker. And then Mo Yan also talked about his development and shaping as a writer with much more pathos, with much more literary power and effectiveness that day. And I was stunned by his seriousness and his commitment to literature, which I didn't sense today. Now my question is, how do you reposition yourself? And in the day that culture and the narrative is no longer presumed a powerful, eminent position in Chinese society. And how do you react to the challenges that market economy and the commercialization of literature in China? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for remembering me. I recall 10 years ago when I came to Berkeley, she and her husband invited to the history department to have a lecture. I said, okay, what do I talk about? Let's talk about wild history, folk stories. So my novels are basically folk stories. Yesterday, I discussed with Chairman Leach about narratives in novels. Many historians write history in their ways. Novelists write history in their ways. Historians pay attention to the events that occurred in history. Leaders and great figures. Novelists pay attention to people and their feelings. We write about feelings and experiences and individual lives. So I think perhaps the history that's written this way, they can allow people to revisit or re-experience history. Whereas history written by historians only recount the events. You titled me as a landmark figure. I actually don't like that.
一旦出了里程碑，就说明这个
As soon as I become a landmark figure, that means that that's the end of it. I have become tombstone.
但是我也不得不承认，
But of course, I have to
我时
acknowledge
代作家的使命基本完成了。
my mission as a novelist has pretty much completed.
如果让中国国内的那些 80后，就是
If you
80年
ask
以后出生的作家，
post-80 young writers, post-80s, post-90s,
评价我们，
if they
评价莫言，
evaluate
他们认为
us,
我们是他
they
们
would
的
think
前进道路上的绊脚
we are their
有的时候
hurdles
那不是里程碑，是绊脚
blocking their
石，
progress.
要搬到一边扔
They
掉
need to
的
be, if I'm the stone, I need to be removed to clear the path for them.
文学家之间确实存
So
在着一代一代的这种 隔阂。
So there are generation
我们当时年
gaps
轻的时候，
even
对
among
这种比我们
in
年老10
literature.
岁、20岁的作家，也是充满了一种不服气。
People senior to us,
夸张了一点，
you know, they are
内
hostile
心深
too.
处是不服气的。你们凭什么在文坛上有这么大的名声？
Why are you so famous
中
in
国国家提
literature?
供的这个官员的位置，全被你们占
You have
了，
taken all
我们去当
the official
啊
seats. Why can we not
各种各样的奖项都给你们
have
这
the-
老家伙
have
包
that
揽了
status
为什么不给我们？
and the young people feel
当然
that
了，
why
最主要的
why
说，
are
你们
you
写的
still
小
in
说
position?
的确不好，我
And
们
they
要写出
they
来
say
跟你们
that
不一样的
your work is
那
uninteresting.
这个风
we
水
can
轮
write
流转
better.
轮流转。那么现在
So
转到，我想
now
80年代以后、90年代以后出生的这
the
些作家，
time is now
对我们
coming
这样
more
的作家
to
也是充满了
younger
这种
writers in their 80s. Post 80s
所
or
以他们
post
现在写的
90s.
小说跟我们写的小说
What they
完
write
全不一样
today
是吧？
is quite different from what
我现在
what we
也非
do
常宽容，我觉得。
I'm actually quite
当年
tolerant
我
of
是
that.
也是一个咬牙
Back in the
切齿的
days, that was how I
一个
felt
委屈
too.
的愤怒的青
I
年。
was rebellion. It
现
was
在我
a
一想，这个应该对这
I-
些年轻
now I
的
feel
作家
that these
是一种
younger
非
people
常理解的态度。
we should understand
他
them,
们
tolerate
现在的
them,
他们就是当年的我。
because what they are today
那么现
is
在的
what
80 后
I
已经
was
30岁了
in the past.
再过20年，他们跟
So
我一样。
for the post 80s,
2010后这样的
they're in their 30s.
当做他们挑战的对象。所以我想，文学是一代一代的发展。
They
那么当然也有人认为，就是
they
说
will
现在这个
they
年轻的
will
作家写的作
develop.
品没有社
Now
会内
some
容，
people say that what they write is has not enough thoughts
因为他们没有经历过苦难。
because they have not
而像我
experienced
这么一个人，经历过这
adversity.
种60
Where
年代的这种
unlike
积弱
us,
年代
we have
经历
been
过中国的文
starved.
化大革命。
We lived
我
through
们个
cultural
人在这
revolution
种不太正常的社会环境
in
里
such
受了很多的苦。
distorted society, social times. We had
而现在这一批年轻的作家，
experience, life experience, whereas the younger people today,
生下
they're
来
single
就在
child
正人的
in their
呵护之
family.
下
They are
吃得好，穿得好，
overindulged
一切都照顾得无微不至。
in material
他们会有
comfort.
什么痛苦？
What kind of suffering have they
那么
gone
但是
through?
我昨天跟利奇主席说
But
过，
like I
是
said
吧
yesterday,
我老是用过去我个人的经历来教育我女儿。你们
always use my own experience to lecture my
蜂
children.
蜜的
You have been brought up in honey
后来这
water,
个我女儿也教
and
训
my
我。
my daughter fought back.
你因为吃饱了、
So
穿暖了就没有痛苦了吗？
you think that if you're well fed and well clothed, then you have no suffering? Well, spiritual suffering can be even worse than physical ones. Our suffering is even worse than yours. So I said, when I was your age, I was herding the cows. She said, that's so idyllic. That's wonderful. I have to do my homework today. In school, after work, after school, I have to go into midnight. Useless homework. I'd rather go to the countryside to herd the cows. So every generation has their challenges. Society is developing. We have lots of material possessions. We have wealth and houses and good living standard. But there's mental and psychological suffering can be even worse. So every generation, every period has its own challenges. And they cannot be replaced. So my position would be
我的定位就是属于我们那个时代的。
I belong to my
当然了，我想
generation,
我
my
是
times.
30年代出生的以后
So
的作
even
家，
though,
还是
so
我们
whether
40
it's
年代出生的作家，
people of the 30s or the 50s or the 80s,
只要是好的文学、好的小说，
good work,
它作品里面还是有一种共同
good
性。
writing
那么这种
has
共同性就是
something
人
in
性。
common, which is
那么这种作品里的人的这种普遍的情感，
human
也是
nature,
世界文学的共性。
feelings and experiences, which
我
is
读了美国
which
作家的
transcends
作品
different
受到感染的
national
原因。
boundaries too.
我想这也是我的小说翻成外文之后，被
That's perhaps why
外
my
国读者的
when
重要的原因。
my work is
那
translated
也就是
in
说，好的文学里
to
面也有
other
一种
languages,
普世的价值
it resonates with
在的。
those readers as well.
There will be many opportunities over the course of the afternoon and also tomorrow morning to continue the conversation. The pleasures of food await us. Before I ask you to join me in thanking our distinguished panelists, I just want to advise the speakers that lunch will be served here in this area on the courtyard directly outside this room, and we will reconvene at approximately 1:40. And now I ask you to join me in thanking this very distinguished panels for their great insights.